The storm was relentless. It wasn't just snow. It was an all-consuming blizzard that howled like a pack of wolves, battering against the windows of my small cabin. The world outside was a swirling void of white, erasing everything beyond a few feet from the frosted glass. It felt like nature itself wanted to isolate me. I'd been warned not to stay here alone during winter, but I didn't listen. Too dangerous, the locals had said. These storms come out of nowhere, and the roads disappear under the snow. Still, the idea of spending a weekend in solitude had been too tempting to resist. After all, what better way to escape the noise of life than a cozy cabin in the mountains? The first 2 days were peaceful, quiet mornings with hot coffee, afternoons spent reading by the fire. But when the storm rolled in yesterday evening, it was like a switch flipped. The atmosphere became heavy, suffocating even. By nightfall, I started noticing things. At first, it was subtle, a faint tapping sound against the windows. I dismissed it as tree branches or maybe the wind kicking up loose ice, but as the night went on, the tapping grew more deliberate, almost rhythmic. It moved from window to window as if someone, or something, was circling the cabin. Today, the storm had only worsened. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and the generator was barely holding up against the freezing temperatures. I spent most of the afternoon trying to convince myself it was all in my head, that the storm was playing tricks on me. But as evening set in, the unease became impossible to ignore. It was around 7 p.m. when I heard it again. A soft, deliberate knock at the front door. I froze. No one should be out in this storm. It was suicidal to even attempt it. I walked to the door, my socks silent on the wooden floor, and peered through the peephole. But all I could see was darkness. The porch light had been swallowed by the storm, and the snowflakes against the glass distorted any chance of making out a shape. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I debated whether to open the door. What if someone was in trouble? But my gut told me something was wrong. I grabbed the fireplace poker. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little less vulnerable. And cracked the door open, just enough to look outside. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing my breath. Snow swirled violently in the air, making it hard to see anything. I scanned the porch. Nothing. Just the emptiness of the storm. Then, just as I was about to shut the door, I saw it. Footprints in the snow, leading up to the porch. They weren't mine. My heart started pounding. The tracks were fresh, not yet covered by the falling snow. And they stopped right at my doorstep. But there was no one there. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I backed away slowly, clutching the poker, like my life depended on it. My eyes darted to the windows, scanning for movement, for a shadow, for anything. That's when the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dim, dying embers in the fireplace. I stood there, frozen, listening to the wind scream outside. Then, over the howl of the storm, I heard it again. Knock, knock. This time it wasn't at the front door. It was at the window. I didn't dare move. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, traveling from one window to the next, circling the cabin just like before. My mind raced. Was it an animal? A prank? Or something far worse? Then, for the first time since the storm began, I felt it, the undeniable sensation that I wasn't alone. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it started. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the muffled roar of the storm outside. My breath hung in the icy air. and I could feel my heart pounding against my rib cage. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to stay still, to not make a sound. But the curiosity, the need to know, was unbearable. Clutching the fireplace poker tighter, I moved toward the nearest window. The glass was frosted over, making it nearly impossible to see outside. My trembling hand reached out to wipe a small circle on the pane, but as soon as I touched the glass, a shadow moved on the other side. I jumped back, nearly dropping the poker. The shadow had been there, just inches away, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Who's out there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice cracked, betraying me. No answer. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows and making the entire cabin groan. I took a few shaky steps back, keeping my eyes on the window, when suddenly there was another knock. This time at the back door. It was loud, deliberate, and far too human. I whipped around, my mind racing. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just trying to get my attention. They were toying with me. Gathering what little courage I had left, I crept towards the back door. The snowstorm was still raging outside, and through the frosted glass, I could barely make out a figure standing there. It wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. Still no response. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. If they were in trouble, I couldn't just leave them out there to freeze to death. But the way they stood, so unnaturally still, made every instinct in me scream to stay away. I moved closer, peering through the glass. The figure was tall, their face obscured by a hood, and their body was wrapped in what looked like a heavy dark coat. Snow swirled around them, but they didn't seem to be affected by the cold. "Are you okay?" I asked, louder this time. The figure tilted their head slightly, as if studying me. Then they raised their hand and knocked again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the curtain closed and backed away from the door. My mind was racing. Who were they? Why wouldn't they speak? And how had they moved from the windows to the back door so quickly? Suddenly, the front door banged loudly, as if someone was throwing their entire weight against it. The sound echoed through the cabin, making me jump. I was trapped. The knocking at the front door grew more aggressive, and now it was accompanied by scratching. Long scraping sounds like nails dragging across the wood. At the same time, the figure at the back door began pounding harder, their movements becoming frantic. I couldn't handle it. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. Then everything stopped. The banging, the scratching, the howling wind outside. Silence. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, heavy, with anticipation. I stood there, gripping the knife and the poker, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But nothing happened. Minutes passed. The only sound was the faint crackling of the dying fire. My body relaxed slightly, though my nerves were still on edge. Maybe they'd given up and left. Maybe the storm had driven them off. I stepped toward the back door, hesitating before pulling the curtain aside. The figure was gone. There were no footprints in the snow outside the door, only an untouched, frozen surface. My relief was short-lived. I turned back toward the living room and froze. The firelight flickered weakly, casting shadows on the walls. But one of the shadows didn't belong. There, near the edge of the room, stood a figure. a dark silhouette that hadn't been there before. My heart dropped into my stomach. The shadow was tall, its outline human, but distorted, like it didn't quite fit the space it occupied. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't move, but I could feel it staring, its presence heavy and suffocating. I took a step back, and as I did, the shadow seemed to ripple, as if it were made of smoke. Then slowly, it started to move toward me. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran toward the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my ears straining to hear any sound on the other side of the door. For a moment there was nothing. Then faintly, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. They stopped just outside the bedroom door. Knock, knock. "Let me in," a voice whispered, barely audible over the storm. It was low, guttural, and utterly inhuman. I pressed my back against the door, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. The voice came again, this time louder. "Let me in." The doorknob rattled violently, and I screamed, clutching the knife tighter. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, alone, and whatever was out there wasn't going to stop. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. The silence returned heavy and oppressive, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was outside that door wasn't gone. It was waiting. I sat against the bedroom door, my back pressed firmly against the wood, clutching the knife in one hand and the poker in the other. My breaths were shallow, and every creak of the cabin felt like an alarm bell in the suffocating silence. The storm outside raged on, its howling winds a constant reminder that escape wasn't an option. Minutes felt like hours, and though the rattling of the doorknob had stopped, I knew it was still there. I could feel its presence, an oppressive, unnatural weight that seemed to seep through the walls. Then faintly, I heard it again. "Let me in," the voice rasped. This time, it was clearer, louder, and impossibly close. It wasn't just at the door anymore. It was inside the room. I shot to my feet, my eyes darting around the dimly lit space. The single window was frosted over, the faint glow of the storm outside barely illuminating the room. Shadows danced across the walls, but one of them didn't move with the flickering light. It was there, standing in the corner. The figure was tall and cloaked in darkness, its edges blurry as though it didn't belong to this world. Two pinpricks of pale light, where its eyes should have been, stared at me, unblinking. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to stand my ground. "Who are you? What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. It didn't respond. Instead, it took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring my fur. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath fogging the air. "I won't let you in," I shouted, holding the knife out in front of me. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if it were considering my words. Then, in a voice that sounded like the wind itself, it whispered, "You already did." A chill ran down my spine. The words didn't make sense, but deep down, I understood. This thing hadn't come from outside. It had always been here, waiting. The storm, the knocking, the footsteps. Those were just distractions. It wanted me to realize I was never alone. I backed toward the window, desperate to put some distance between us. My hand brushed against the frost-covered glass, and an idea formed in my mind. If I couldn't fight it, Maybe I could escape. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I turned and slammed the poker into the window. The glass shattered and the icy wind roared into the room. The cold was brutal, biting at my skin. But I didn't care. I climbed through the broken frame, cutting my hands on the shards, and dropped into the snow outside. The storm was blinding, but I ran. My boots sank into the snow with every step, and the freezing air burned my lungs. But I didn't stop. I could still feel it behind me, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I didn't know where I was going. The cabin had been isolated, miles away from any other structure, but I couldn't stay there. My only hope was to keep moving and hope that the storm would hide me. Then, through the swirling snow, I saw it. A faint light in the distance, a flickering golden glow that felt like salvation. I pushed myself harder, stumbling toward it. As I got closer, I realized it was another cabin, larger than mine, with smoke curling from its chimney. I reached the door and pounded on it with everything I had left. "Help! Please let me in." The door creaked open, and an elderly man peered out, his face etched with concern. "What on earth are you doing out here in this storm?" he asked, pulling me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. "There's something out there," I managed to say. "It was in my cabin. It's coming." The man's expression darkened. He glanced out the window, then back at me. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. Before I could ask what he meant, the lights in the cabin flickered and went out. The fire in the hearth dimmed until it was just embers. And then from the shadows, I heard it again. Knock, knock. The man backed away from the door, his face pale. "It's too late," he whispered. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the entire cabin was shaking. I clutched the knife tighter, my heart pounding as in my chest. The man turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "It doesn't stop," he said, "not until it gets what it wants." I didn't get the chance to ask what that was. The door burst open, and the storm swept in, carrying with it the shadowy figure. It towered over us, its pale eyes glowing with malice. This time, there was nowhere to run.